Welcome everybody to our second slot of the Diversity and Inclusion Week. Today I have with me here Jamie Gloor. Jamie, hi there. As usual, please ask your questions using the Q&A button. The questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation. And that's it. I won't steal your time any longer. Jamie, the floor is yours.
All right. As Jules said, I'm Jamie Gloor, here to present on intersectionality. So some key insights, examples, and implications. All right, so who am I? I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Management since the beginning of this year at the University of St. Gallen, affiliated with the CCDI, the Competence Center for Diversity and Inclusion. So I've garnered 15 plus years across 4 continents of mostly research experience in the areas of psychology and business, including 2 years at Yale before moving to Switzerland. My areas of interest and expertise are diversity, leadership, and humor. Seems strange to call myself a humor expert, but after 15 plus years, I guess I can claim that. I'm a quantitative researcher. I like to do experiments, which means I intervene, I add something or I take something away based on a random assignment and then measure the outcome. So you can really have a causal claim that this caused this. Includes changes by design, for example. And my approach is generally interdisciplinary, mixing social psychology, organizational behavior, as well as economics. So that gives you a bit of my background from where I'm coming from, which informs this presentation. Thank you to our sponsors, first and foremost, for making this happen. As Jules said, we'll answer the questions after the presentation. Use the Q&A button. Don't use the chat for questions, but since this is the time on average in pupils' days where you're actually a bit lagging in terms of energy and motivation, we're going to start off with a bit of an interactive activity to get you guys energized, reactivate you a bit. All right, so here we go. We're going to start off with a little interactive activity. So you guys can feel free to use the chat. I'll be following the chat for this. When you see this, what do you see? You can name one thing. Go ahead and use the chat to write down what you see. Triangle, pyramid, crosswalk. All right. So Fußgängerweg, yeah, circle. Another crosswalk, a pyramid and a circle, okay. All right, so we've got a diversity of vision. Somebody's getting symbolic here. All right. So yes, all of these are correct. What about this next one? What do you see? And again, this is a safe space. What comes to your mind first? I see woman, businesswoman, professional, business look, leader. These answers are probably a little skewed because this is a diversity and inclusion week and the intersectionality event, CEO even, okay, all right. So everything from gender to profession to role. I see now Black woman, so some race or ethnicity there. All right. How about one more? What do you see here? Human being, that might have been for the last one. Okay, now this one's dad. Multitasking, okay, so the activity is what they're doing, dad with kid. A man looking after his baby. Overwhelmed, yeah, perhaps. Struggle. Coffee, yeah. Man with baby. Yeah. All right. So thank you very much for humoring me here with this first exercise. The goal of this was not to, of course, have you label people or things, but to point to the diversity in kind of what people have, how they react to stimuli in the first case, or to people in the other two cases, kind of the first reaction, the first impression. All of those were accurate, right? That's what you saw, that was your perception. And from what we know from these images, that's what they were as well, like a pyramid or a geometric shape, maybe, if you're talking about the first one. And this idea is illustrative of the concept we'll be talking about today, because most of your responses were tapping into these single characteristics. I kind of guided you in that direction in the beginning, but that's what oftentimes these diversity studies, interventions, initiatives, policies are geared towards: single constructs of diversity, right? Whether it's targeting gender, because they're wanting to promote more women in the workforce or in management and leadership. That's a very, very common one these days. You see a lot of initiatives targeting parents in terms of the recently passed parental leave policies, for example, in Switzerland. But here, we're going to talk about intersectionality. So that's talking about the interplay of several social group memberships. So what do we mean by social group memberships? This is based on the social identity theory. So the idea that people belong to several groups, various facets of their identity. They can draw membership and meaning from those. Like, for example, I am an assistant professor. I'm also a mother. I'm also a woman. I'm also a spouse. I'm also an American, if you can't tell by my accent, right? So I have these kind of labels for myself, but I also generate some sort of identity, some membership, some affiliation and belonging also from these memberships, because that's kind of the role that these social identities play for us, right? And so intersectionality is referring to not me as a woman or as a professor, but how these things come together. And so the most common examples that we're talking about here is about characteristics, so kind of visible demographic characteristics. The most common one often being the intersection of gender and race or ethnicity. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. But it's also important to note that intersectionality is not just about these labels or these categories or these group memberships, but how they interact and how they're contextually defined, right? Because oftentimes groups have bring with them various meanings based on historical policies, treatment, power structures, privilege, oppression, for example, in the US. This term was actually coined by a legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was trying actually to label something that she hadn't encountered before, right? Because if you don't have a name for something, it's kind of hard to then label that, to do something about it, right? To solve it if there's not even a name for it. Because she came across a case where an employee who was a female, she was a woman, and she was also Black, was facing discrimination at work, and so pursued legal recourse, but the judge denied it, saying that this person could not pursue legal recourse as a Black woman because the company employed many Black people. They all happened to be men. They employed many women, although all happened to be white or Caucasian women. So the judge's reasoning was that this person could have almost an advantage by being able to have kind of two chances at the bat, so to speak. So two kind of avenues for pursuing legal recourse, when in actuality, she was facing two doses of bias, or it's often called double jeopardy, for example. Because in the particular context, being a woman and being a Black woman resulted in even more disadvantage than either of the two identities on their own. Yes, so in general, intersectionality is less of a theory and more of kind of a metaphor for kind of understanding how these identities can come together, and by coming together, change the experience of that person in how they define themselves, but also, and perhaps most importantly for this context when we're talking about the workplace, how others react to them, form stereotypes about them, expectations, and eventually also treat them. So while this has applications, of course, to the legal realm, to schools, to police violence, even particularly in the US, this is a very real and relevant topic at the moment. We're going to talk about intersectionality in the workplace. All right, so you might have already imagined this picture in your mind when we're talking about it, right? Because the term itself conjures images of an intersection, right? So this is a very American typical kind of intersection here. So I'm kind of exposing my perspective in giving you this to imagine. There's a lot of circles here in Switzerland and in Europe, but this of course fits this example nicely because you're thinking of each street as kind of a potential pathway, a potential identity, for example. So I've labeled these with some of the key aspects or dimensions of identity that are often studied in this context. So gender, of course, and here I keep using gender, and I'm referring to kind of biological sex, but I know with language differences, sex can connote many different things. So just know that I'm talking about it in that respect, not in a more fluid, continuous respect. Race or ethnicity, age, social class. That's something also that even though it's maybe a bit harder to infer just from a first impression, something that also is very, very relevant for workplace impressions and decisions and leadership, often inferred from clothing, from vocabulary, from people's networks, institutions that people went to for education, for example, in the US, on and on. So again, these are just illustrative. But the idea is that instead of just having kind of one pathway, one street, this person's identity is signified by the star in the middle at the core of this intersection, right? And this is important, of course, because the meanings of one of them changes depending on having another and the meaning that this other aspect of identity can have. So to give you a different kind of visual, so we're not just speaking in words here, and this is a bit jargony, I'll give you some alternative words to label this on the next slide. But Hall and colleagues actually adapted and updated this model of intersectionality because it was a very helpful metaphor, kind of image, framework for understanding. But as I said, it wasn't really a precise theory in a sense. So what Hall and colleagues did is they further increased the precision in adding these labels for the various categories. So first, there's a foundational category. That is the kind of initial impression that you have of someone. And oftentimes from what we know from social cognitive research, from the science of how people form impressions of others, gender is often a very primary one. And we saw that also in your responses on the very first example, right? Many people were calling her a woman. Only later did people notice a Black woman or write Black woman in the area. So of course, maybe that was a bit of social desirability, people not wanting to acknowledge race first, but that's also consistent with what we know from the literature. Usually gender, so being a man or a woman, is one of the first dimensions, first axes that people pay attention to, and then race would fall in the second category. So it's a woman and she's Black, so she's a Black woman, for example. And then when these two things combine, not in an additive or subtractive sense, so it's not like 1 + 1, but really depending on the meaning of them, a second category can improve or decrease, harm the initial category. And then in the end, these combine to have this template-based outcomes. So what do I mean? You have a primary characteristic and then a secondary one, and then these combine to have a lens. Of course, we define ourselves, and even your answers at the beginning tapped into even more than two categories. But for simplicity's sake, I'm kind of showing you it here in a bit of a simpler form, because this is intended, yeah, as a introduction, right? So you have a characteristic, and then the moderator, as we would call it in science, and then this outcome, how they combine. And what this lens, this output, it can be visibility, for example. So if you're thinking of the context of an executive board, we know that women in general are the minority of board members. So if you have a woman amongst all other men, or you might call her a token woman, right? She's going to be a bit more visible. But if also that woman is a racial or ethnic minority member, then that person might be even more visible, right? If all of the other board members, for example, are white Caucasian men. So that's one example, how it increases or decreases visibility. The other type of outcome that these predict is proscriptions. What do we mean by that? That is the kind of behaviors and expectations that these people are not kind of allowed to do. For example, women are technically facing proscriptions of agentic behavior. So women often face backlash or social penalties if they behave in a masculine and a dominant kind of competitive way. Those are all like proscriptions based on the gender role. There are also prescriptions, so expectations that are encouraged. Based on the general, again, if we're talking about the example of women, they're kind of expected to be, you know, nice and warm and communal and other-oriented, right? Engaging in behaviors that benefit the group, consideration, and things like this. So, so far, I hope that makes a bit of sense. I'll give maybe a few more examples of the combination of these two and how those affect proscriptions and prescriptions. So for example, while women often face a proscription for various emotions, for example, acting angry, because that is often kind of deemed an agentic sort of emotion. Actually, Black women can engage in more anger, can show more anger than white women, right? So I think that's a key example I wanted to mention here, because intersectionality is, of course, often talked about, and rightly so, disadvantages. So the kind of additive disadvantage of both being a woman and a racial minority, and how those two things, if they're both devalued in that context, in that organization, for that role in that society, right, those will increase the disadvantage that person feels, right? But it could also buffer against some of the disadvantage, in this case, for anger, for example. And another one is that, of course, prescriptions are things that, again, to remind you that we're expected to do. So, for example, research has shown that women who are Black actually get more benefit from smiling and engaging in a very friendly, pleasant behavior like that than white women. So again, showing how there are some, of course, additive disadvantages, but also some advantages. One example that is relevant also to another talk during this week that our team at the CCDI is really engaged in, right, in the wage analyses, right? So if you're thinking about single axes of identity, as is often the case, so the gender wage gap, for example, that's focused on one dimension, gender or sex as we were calling it, right? That kind of assumes that every woman within this category is facing the same sort of disadvantage, the same sort of wage penalty, for example, based on the gender, the unexplained gap. But we know that's not the case, right? We know that women of color have an even greater wage penalty than white or Caucasian women, right? So that's, again, another example of intersectionality and why it's important and relevant to various kinds of outcomes, such as visibility, proscriptions, and prescriptions. All right. So are there any questions first before we keep going? I know we said we would hold them to the end, but this is a bit of a very scientific talk. So I want to make sure that we understand the basic framework before moving on to the practical implications and recommendations. Can go ahead and mention it even in the chat. I know you were told not to, but I'm a bit of a rebel with this, I guess. All right. I see one in the Q&A. Explain the term race. Okay, so when we're talking about race or ethnicity here, I'm of course limited in the research that I know on the topic. So it's often referring to white or Caucasian, and Black or African American is often the case if they're studying US samples. Race and ethnicity can also include Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, I think is the term we often use in our research these days. It also includes Asian. I think Arab we've used in several of our surveys as well. And then of course other, because as we said, people can have multiple race and ethnicity that they identify with, or their parents came from. We often also allow for people to select multiple ones or add their additional ones. But that's what we mean when we're talking about race and ethnicity, at least in this context. Okay, I hope that cleared things up. Okay, so now that you know what intersectionality is, the motivation for why it was developed, some examples of how two or more dimensions might combine and affect various kinds of outcomes, we're going to move into what do we do about it, right? So we know that intersectionality affects various outcomes. So in addition to how people define themselves and experience everyday life, visibility, again, if you're thinking of the tokenism, that's a key aspect of being a token, is that they're more visible, right? Because they kind of contrast from the other individuals in whatever reference group, whether it's a team or an executive committee. It influences the stereotypes, bias, and discrimination that these people face. And a related point, if it's influencing the categories people think of someone, then it's also influencing the stereotypes and thus the expectations. And it's all very much a cycle, because we know from the research, right, once a categorization has been made and someone has been kind of put in a box, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not the stereotypes are accurate, right? It is much harder to then update and correct those stereotypes and biases than to have formed more accurate impressions from the beginning, right? Number 5, affects social mistreatment. I'll talk about my research that goes in this direction on the next slides, but I do want to note that in talking about this, it includes terms like incivility, so that's a subtle disrespect, microaggressions, slights, undermining, things like this. It's given that it has become increasingly non-normative with the laws and rules for social conduct in recent decades, it's become less and less kind of socially allowed to blatantly or explicitly express gender stereotypes or bias towards someone, right? So the research is generally kind of showing converging evidence across these similar phenomenon with various names, right? Incivility, microaggressions, and whatnot. That's kind of the way that that these things are manifesting. In addition to more blatant types of bias and discrimination, of course, when you're talking about less likely to be hired or promoted into a leadership position. But I think this is an important point that I wanted to make sure I mention. Hiring and promotions, salary, bonus, wages, almost anything, any outcome that you can think of that is relevant for talking about single or individual kind of aspects of identity. Intersectionality is also going to play a role here. Intersectionality is going to be relevant. So maybe baby is a key phenomenon of interest that is epitomizing intersectionality. It's from started with my dissertation work, and it's basically describing a phenomenon at the intersection of gender and parenthood, so having kids or not having kids, and age. So the idea of kind of these prime childbearing years versus not, like versus younger or older than that. As kind of insinuated by this picture, maybe baby bias is the idea that even child-free women, so women who don't have children, can be viewed under certain circumstances as their kind of potential mothers, in essence, that they don't have a child now, but they're going to have a child in the future, which seems like a lot of steps in the logic. But I'll explain the research we did to show this here. So in a series of studies with all Swiss data, we found that child-free, childbearing age women face more disrespect, this social mistreatment from colleagues, and they were viewed as kind of the highest risk. Why? Well, we know in Switzerland, right, that that women have access to greater parental leave. So in the case that a woman were to become pregnant, they are definitely allowed to be out of work for much longer than men, who I guess now they have 2 weeks, but it still pales in comparison often to the 16 weeks or more that women are allowed to have, right? So it's kind of a longer period of time that they're going to be out of work. It's often too short to have a replacement. So oftentimes colleagues or even the supervisor has to kind of take over that work. And so in one paper we showed, they were kind of viewed as a potential inconvenience if they were to have a child and leave for this time. And so that increased the disrespect that these young child-free women were facing from their colleagues. And when I say young, I mean early 30s. So this kind of period right around the average childbearing age in Switzerland for trained professionals, for educated professionals. And that predicted 1 year later, these women's withdrawal from the workplace, right? So you've probably seen these pipelines, the leaky pipelines, right? And so one of the motivations for this study was to try to understand some of the reasons why women are leaking out, okay? But beyond the problematic metaphor, because we know it's not just a leak, as this study showed, right, they're kind of being pushed out because they're viewed as a potential inconvenience, at least more so than their male colleagues who wouldn't be gone for so long, right? And then the other study showed that they're viewed as actually a higher risk. So when they're not yet in the organization, hiring managers basically view them as potentially higher risk for some of the same reasons that I mentioned. So potentially being away for the length of maternity leave, or even more if they decide to stay at home. I mean, we all know how expensive childcare is in Switzerland. I think for my 4-year-old, we pay, in essence, a pretty nice car, the value of a pretty nice car every year for his kita. So that, of course, is one of the reasons why some women may stay at home. But again, this drives a risk, and hiring managers compensate for that risk by offering them shorter length jobs, more temporary versus permanent, with fewer benefits to kind of counteract or counterbalance some of this risk. Yeah, so here it is again. Those are kind of the outcomes that we studied, and we found by looking at this intersection, so not just gender, because if we had just looked at gender here, we wouldn't have seen any real differences, because mothers actually in this study and the other, so this is based on two papers. You can see they're both linked at the bottom of the slide. If we just looked at gender, we wouldn't have seen as large differences as the reality of these women is really reflecting, because when we incorporated parenthood status, we saw that child-free women were facing much more negative expectations of maybe baby than the mothers. And we explained this because the fertility rate is quite low in Switzerland. So if a mother already has a child, she may be less likely to have another one. But if so, she's already demonstrated her kind of desire and ability to combine work and family, whereas the child-free woman hasn't yet. So again, just another aspect of risk. All right, so beyond maybe baby, some questions that you can ask yourself. Who are you? What are some aspects of your identity that are meaningful and valuable for you? What are some of the ones that you think of other people? Because the key aspect of these social identities is that once you make a category, that immediately makes a like us versus them, right? A you versus the applicant. So this is often a challenge in evaluating, potentially trying to hire people who are different than across some of these social demographic categories than the hiring managers. So the idea is try to find a who are we. So what are some things that that we might share in common? For example, all of us attending this talk today, this event this entire week, right? We're maybe all interested in diversity and inclusion. Maybe we're all kind of diversity inclusion professionals, you could categorize us. Maybe even after the AM, we're all Jan Sommer fans, right? Because he did such a great job there in the as goalie. So the idea is to try to kind of think about these nuances because they're important for how you define yourself, but how you also view and treat potential applicants, other people in the workplace, right? So some concrete recommendations following from all of this, right, is to first acknowledge complexity, right? It's not so simple as one category, as one kind of box to check on a list, right? There are multiple axes that come together and meaningfully shape the way that you categorize and think about and form expectations and decisions towards people. Another is to measure, right? So oftentimes we find in this research, as well as in many practical initiatives and whatnot, the idea that what isn't measured doesn't matter, right? So you can't even analyze in many cases sexuality, for example, this more continuous measurements of gender or race and ethnicity in a lot of the wage analyses, I think, is a challenge because it's not asked, it's not in those databases. So make sure to try to keep an eye on that. I know sexuality, I think, is increasingly being asked as well. There are, of course, concerns about potentially facing discrimination once divulging that information. But if anonymity, confidentiality can be assured, tracking, I think, can be important in the right hands for the right initiatives, right? Try to find a shared identity or experience, right? Because once, again, these forces that encourage categorization, you can find shared categorizations as well, whether it's Jan Sommer fans or diversity inclusion professionals. We could spend the entire session just talking about the various ways that you can categorize yourself in meaningful ways. So the kind of sky is the limit here. And then there's a space between these last ones, because while the first three, I think, were more specific recommendations to intersectionality, these last two, I think, are relevant to kind of any forms of singular dimensions of diversity or also intersectional dimensions. So the research is showing, of course, take more time. For example, in hiring decisions, I'm not trying to overburden or ask something very huge here. We know that on average, hiring managers spend 6 seconds with each application. So viewing each CV for a job, 6 seconds. And we know that all these stereotypes and things are activated because they are heuristics, right? To kind of help make sense of complex applications, complex world, complex people, right? But simply aim to take more than 6 seconds. 10 could be, for example, a goal. It's already almost doubling, right? And number 5, I think, is important to mention, avoiding positive bias, because very often is the case in these discussions that we get kind of stuck in talking about negative biases. And those are very important. But in the case of, for example, hiring or even promotion decisions, several studies have shown actually that positive bias towards applicants who seem more like you, to share more identities or demographic characteristics, for example, the positive bias towards those who seem more similar is often stronger than a negative bias towards those who are viewed to be more different, right? So Also from, for example, taking unconscious bias tests or something, when people find out that they have a bias, they can react negatively, right? Because that's kind of telling them that something is wrong with them, even though we know that based on the messages and experience that we have, everybody is biased, right? But they can react defensively if you inform people and try to encourage them to avoid negative bias. So take time and try to avoid positive bias. Those, I think, are two recommendations based on research that can apply to intersectional as well as individual kind of diversity elements. All right. So coming back to our kind of sticky image here of our intersection, the goal is, you know, when the war for talent is increasingly tough, we know that in the future of work, we need to make use of all of our trained talents, especially our diverse talents, to face the new and diverse range of challenges that we're going to be faced with. These complex kind of grand challenges, so to speak, we need everybody's voices. So the idea is to make sure that while we're focused on keeping the traffic flowing in the lanes, that we also don't overlook that some people might have crashed at the intersections, right? Because in the end, a crash in the intersection can harm traffic for everybody, right? Thank you. Who has questions? Let's see, I have a comment in the chat. Okay, thanks, Gudrun. Thanks for coming. We can move on to the question and answer. I see 2 already. Okay, so first, any tips on a maybe baby woman can do to avoid discrimination, specifically looking at the individual? Okay, so I think that one was referring to what the woman can do herself, if I interpreted that correctly. So while I think we might all agree that the onus should not be on the applicants themselves to kind of prevent other people's biases against them, I think it's also something kind of smart to do, given that we know these biases are everywhere and they are affecting hiring and promotion decisions, right? So for example, it's kind of humorous, but I had a child. So I bridged the theory practice gap from my own research. I'm not recommending that for everyone else. We also tested 2 different interventions in our research. So one was emphasizing their commitment to the job, given that these negative biases and expectations of maybe baby bias are often kind of snap judgments based on that quick impression of the person, simply repeating the commitment to the job, to doing a good job, regardless of family or having a child or not. That was actually effective in our research as well. And from an organizational level though, in case you meant what can we do against maybe baby bias from an organizational level, not the applicants themselves, we would also recommend, which it's going in this direction a little bit policy-wise in Switzerland, to offer more options of less lopsided parental leave, right? So one reason that maybe baby is so prominent in Switzerland compared to other contexts is because women receive so much more maternity leave. They will be gone for so much longer in the case that they would have a child than men, right? So offering men more leave or some shared pot of leave that could be used by either the man or woman at least reduces some of that very lopsided parental leave that we have right now. Okay, the next one says, can you repeat what positive biases are? Yes. So in talking about one of the recommendations for gender bias or for bias based on intersectional categories, we mean positive biases is kind of the attraction that you might have, a likability to someone who seems more similar to you, right? So for example, if I was evaluating a candidate and I found a female who is 34 and has their PhD and they're from the US, that person might seem more similar to me. And so whether I know it or not, whether I realize it or not, I think that's an important point actually. So thank you for asking this. I think whether people realize it or conscious of it or unconscious, I'm kind of drawn to that person because they remind me of me. So it's like a similarity attraction bias or homophily, it's often referred to in sociology. That's what we mean by positive bias. Okay, Lisa asks, how do you react when somebody, the interviewer, asks you at a job interview if you plan to get pregnant anytime soon, even though it is not appropriate to ask this question? Lisa, great question. That was actually an instance that happened to me and also motivated my pursuing this line of research. I was having a professional career talk with a top scholar in the field and asking about strategy. So going back to the US, staying in Europe, and the person went straight to, oh, but what are your plans for a family? And I was kind of aghast, surprised. I didn't expect that because it's not allowed if you're in a formal situation to ask. I think legally you're even allowed to lie about it if you are asked this question. But in thinking about relationships, right? Because I knew I was going to see this person over and over. I didn't want to point out, you know, oh, you actually can't ask me that, you know, because that would shut down the conversation, that would harm our relationship. That person could have also been asking just out of curiosity. I don't know the motivation, but actually I responded with humor. So I said, oh, I've got 2 cats now, because this was about 5 years ago before I had my kid. And that's, you know, I've got 2 cats for now, and kind of implying this, that the cats are my children. And we actually know from recent research that when you respond with humor, for example, it diffuses the situation and it redirects as well. So even though you didn't answer, because you don't have to answer, both people in that interaction save face. Nobody's offended. You didn't answer. So, you know, if you do want kids or not, it's still up in the air. You can decide. And yeah, you're able to continue the conversation because it's kind of a redirector as well. So you can feel free to use my joke. It's a good one if you have cats, I guess. And then another question. So are there frameworks that allow hiring managers to consider intersectionality in a systematic way? I'm not sure exactly what's meant by this one. I mean, for example, the first thing I thought of is the Hall framework that I showed you on the slide. So it was a more recent kind of update of intersectionality framework, which was originally from Crenshaw. Hall and colleagues kind of formulated this idea of having kind of a primary axis and then kind of a secondary one that influences the primary axis, but maybe not so much. And then they combined to predict this outcome. So I would say that would actually be a framework that I would recommend. And again, that resource is cited on that slide. So you will have access to it once the slides are shared. If you mean something else, I mean, some sort of very basic rudimentary framework could be something like an Excel file. If you have all of your personnel or employees listed in some sort of file, and you have multiple axes of identity, so gender, age, parenthood, race or ethnicity, you can analyze that and do some kind of subgroup analyses to see like, okay, so we see this effect of gender that women on average are paid 5,000 less than the men in this position. But looking at the women of color, for example, they're paid even less. So that's a very, I think, rudimentary way to look at it in the case of wages. If you meant something else, feel free to ask another question here. See some questions in the chat. So Lisa said, great answer about the humor, I think, in responding to the maybe baby question. The interviewer actually laughed. We both laughed, and then we moved on. So that was again, like a redirector. So it was kind of acknowledging the question with an answer, even though it wasn't an answer, and we moved on to something else after a laugh. I see something else here. Do men talk as much as women about having kids, getting up in the night, having stress due to kids, work, and everything around having kids? From Bettina. I'm not sure. At least from the research, you would think that actually women might get penalized for it if they're in a leadership position and if they're in a more masculine area. For example, management, economics, professional services, in many cases, they might face bias because that kind of highlights their focus or their engagement in the family role, which is incongruent with the professional role. Whereas men actually, they are already kind of viewed as more committed than women in general. So if they talk about family, actually, I myself and some colleagues have some research on this. They actually face a positive bonus for mentioning kids because they're kind of viewed as this breadwinner, and they don't face penalties like women do when they highlight family. So I'm not sure base rates about men talking about it versus women talking about it. I would probably guess that it's men talk about it less on average than women do, but men also face positive bonuses for it, and women often face more negative penalties. All right, so we still have 51 people here. We have a few more minutes. I wanted to make sure that we stopped early enough to have a lot of time for questions and answers, because I know intersectionality is kind of one of these new terms and frameworks. So I wanted to make sure that we could really dig into what's relevant for you. I don't want to hold you because we know time is of the essence, and actually we're about out of time here. So I'm going to show you the slides, the final slides here. So if you enjoyed today, thank you for coming. Come and join us this afternoon. The rest of the week, we're on site tomorrow for the Gender Intelligence Report reveal. A lot of interesting workshops for you lined up. The CCDI also, of course, has several other offerings. So check these out, register, join us, continue these conversations that we've started here. Thanks again to our sponsors, and thank you. Have a good one, everybody. Feel free to follow up with me per email if you have any other specific questions or topics. Thanks. Bye.